You guys hear me? Is this working? Yeah. Okay. So Vivek and Don asked me to talk to you about user-centered design and in particular how it relates to user engagement. So what I want to do today is give you a little bit of a background about what the user design process is like and why you might want to use it in your research. And then talk through some of the considerations that you should be thinking about as when you're developing remote work systems that affect how individuals perceive it and whether they're likely to stick with it or not. So let's start with an example. So how many of you have seen this little gizmo? Yeah, a few of them. This was a little activity tracker that came out a few years ago called Misfit Shine, which was had really beautiful industrial design. It was sort of the size of a coin, and it was kind with all kinds of advertisements. This is the best thing that ever came to activity tracking. So you were supposed to have these ads that you could wear it anywhere, and you were supposed to be able to wear it in different places. And it would detect all kinds of activity, so walking and running and cycling and swimming, and it would seamlessly sync with your phone and give you all kinds of information about your activity. So Max saw this thing. I got one for research, and she really liked it, and she said she wanted to have one as well. So I got one for her. She started wearing it, and then a couple of weeks later, I was going to pull out the shirt from the closet, and I saw this thing sitting in the back of the closet next to the hair dryer. And she used it for a little bit over 10 days and never picked it up again. Right? And so what happened in this particular case? So there are a few things that led to her abandoning this technology. The main one was this violation of her expectation of what this thing was going to do. And in particular, what she got really pissed off about is that every time she would take a walk with the baby, pushing the baby in the stroller, she would get no steps. Because she was wearing it on her wrist, she was walking around carting the stroller, and the accelerometer was not picking up steps. She's not technical, she doesn't really care how this thing works, but it was supposed to detect her walking and it was not detecting her walking. She also had absolutely no way of correcting the data. So she would come back from a walk, there were no steps, and she couldn't fix it, right? And then there were some durability and usability issues. For example, the little band that it was used to keep it on the wrist, it would just keep popping out. So after it popped out for the third time, she just had to stop it and got put into the closet. Doesn't take much to end up in the closet. And I think this is really a key message that the way to think about these technologies that we're developing, by and large, with very rare exceptions, they're discretionary use tools. Your users are going to decide whether to use these things or not, and more often than not, they decide not. Right? And the statistics bear this. So these are stats from a few years ago, but things haven't really changed that much. So about a quarter of them get used only once and never again. Most of them get abandoned by the testers. Given the kinds of problems we're dealing with, right, and we're trying to affect long-term behaviors, this is terrible, right? I mean, we're not going to be able to do this if most of our technology gets abandoned by the testers. So the question is, what can we do to design technologies that don't end up being left in a drawer or on the back of the closet? And one of the things I want to suggest is that one way to approach this is as a design problem, right? And the design is something that can help you come up with better solutions that are going to be potentially and hopefully used over themselves. So in the first part of the talk, I want to tell you about what design is, how we should be thinking about it, and how to think about the process that leads to design. So first, let's just all get on the same page about what we talk about when we're actually talking about when we talk about design. And probably the single best statement of this that I've seen comes from Steve Jobs, who said that most people make the mistake of thinking that design is what it looks like. People think it's the veneer, basically putting lipstick on the pig. That a designer is handed a system and then they just sort of make it look pretty. It's not just what it looks like, it feels like. Design is how it works, and this is really fundamental. That and Charles Eames, preeminent designer of the mid-20th century, basically says the same thing. That it's a plan for arranging elements in such a way as to best accomplish a particular goal. So really, when you're thinking about design, you should be thinking about what are the elements that need to be a part of the system, how are they arranged, what interaction is like, to create a coherent, usable experience for people that fits into their lives and their goals and values, so that they actually want it, right? And the design process helps you get to that. to that goal. The other piece that we should really keep in mind is that designing is a process. There's a set of steps that designers follow to some variation to actually get to the result of creating robust artifacts that fulfill their purpose well. We teach our master students, we take a whole semester to walk them through this process. I'm going to just give you some highlights of what the process looks like and why, but there's a lot more to dive into if this is interesting to you. So one way to think about this is that there's sort of 4 distinct stages that loop on themselves over and over again as part of the design process. The first one is that the stage of just framing the problem. What is it that you're actually trying to do? And it's very rarely, and only in the simplest cases, that we're actually handing the problem that is already well framed, right? Most of the things that you guys are doing as you're working on these problems this week is actually reformulating what's the problem. And then as you make progress, your understanding of the domain and the problem changes, and you go back and you refine what it is that you're trying to solve. This is a fundamental part of the design process that involves both doing formative work, so they're working with users, as well as the literature search and other techniques that they use to really just nail down what it is that this thing should be doing and what is the exact problem that they're trying to solve. What's the scope of that problem? What is in and out? Right? How generalized the problem is? All of that needs to be addressed in a very explicit way in order to have effective design. Another big chunk of the design process is this notion of the ideation, and this is probably one of the most distinct things that the designers do versus other professionals who work on solving problems, which is and I'll be coming back to this, which is that designers try to create a whole lot of possible solutions for any given thing, and then we'll go through a systematic process of trying to evaluate those solutions against each other and select them like that. Then we have structured ways of doing that kind of selection, of scoping, of doing the trade-off analysis for different solutions. And finally, designers tend to create many early stage sort of iterations of the design solutions that they can get feedback on before they ever get to a point where they hand something over to a programmer to build code, right? And what's important to note is that this is not a linear process. These stages happen time and time again, and as your understanding of the project increases, you often have to backtrack to both reframe it and do more ideation, do more selection, and so on. And you do that both at the level of the project as a whole and individual components of the project and of the project, as well as how exactly particular features work. So this is repeated over and over again as you progress through a design project. So formative work is something that is absolutely essential to design, and this is something you guys largely rely on literature for in this particular week. But typically, what you would do is you'd be going to talk to users a lot to understand how they see the world, what the constraints are, all the stuff that Vicky was talking about yesterday. The kind of understanding, deep understanding of all the users and their needs that you need to have in order to actually develop solutions that fit their context well, needs to be done up front. What's different about design is that we actually have some concrete ways of formalizing what you're finding through the formative research in forms that allow you to move towards a effective design solution more quickly and more efficiently. And one of those is the social personas. You might have seen this, but basically personas are quasi-fictional characters that are distillation of what you have learned about your population and their context, that allow you to have a really concrete representations of users that you're designing for. So even though the personas themselves are made up, the actual data that goes into creation of the personas is very much a distillation of what you might. And here's an example of someone. So you have some demographic information that you typically use, but really the big things that make personas useful are things that are understood like motivators and constraints. These are the things that end up determining whether a particular design solution is a good match for a person. And what you want to do is basically create a number of personas that represent the space of users that you're trying to do. Another very concrete design representation that is often created in the process of designer scenarios, which are basically short stories that start translating your understanding of what the problem is and the users that you're trying to reach to a particular set of features that your solution might have. In this case, we're talking. This is an example of this activity intervention that basically provides just-in-time support for getting some more activity throughout the day. But without necessarily going into the detail of the scenario, what's important to note about it is this is basically a paragraph of text. You can crank this out in 5 to 10 minutes. You can do a bunch of them. You can change them. You can run them by your users and see, does this resonate with them? Then tear them up and do it over again, right? There is very little time investment into building scenarios like this. And which is one of the main reasons why they're so effective at moving the design process forward, is because you can iterate on them a lot until you actually have a sense of what kind of a solution is going to work really well for your population, and then you can move towards more detailed approaches. So all of this stuff is happening at the level of formative work. Right, you're defining who your population is, and you're slowly starting to get a sense of the range of solutions that are possible and how they might fit in their lives and what kind of reactions you might have, right? So scenarios, personas, storyboards, all of those kinds of design representations allow you to actually distill what you're finding in the formative work in a very structured way into things that will move the design process forward. Another big part of the design process is this notion of ideation. Again, the basic idea here is to create a lot of ideas and a lot of concepts about your solution that you can then use to choose among them for the strongest solution. And my mental model of this is, for those of you who have done a lot of explorations of the data, you can think of it as a sort of difference between a local maximum and a global maximum curve, right? Where often what we do intuitively is we have an idea and then we want to just refine it to get it to be better and better until. But often the idea we start with is a suboptimal idea. Ideation allows you to basically have to consider a full range of possible options, so you can actually pick the thing that is going to lead you to in the long run. And we have some empirical data that this is actually effective. So Stephen Dow, who is now at UCSD, has done created a really nice body of work showing that people who do parallel prototyping, who ideate a lot and try to push multiple versions of the solution forward, end up creating better solutions than if you just take one idea and then you refine it over time. The basic rules of ideation are that you want to create ideas as quickly as possible. So the idea here is to make creation of ideas cheap in terms of time, cheap in terms of effort. And what that allows you to do is to throw most of them away, right? So there's a trade-off here between how much work you spend on something and how willing you are to discard it, right? And one of the things that often happens is that we invest so much energy into something that by the time we realize it's not a great idea, there's just no going back, right? Ideation helps you avoid that situation. You will create ideas quickly, and then it's perfectly fine if 95% of them end up being crap. You can just get rid of them and create some more, right? And you can do that in, again, sort of principled ways where you generate both variations on an idea as well as try to create as many different ideas in your design space as you can. And at that stage of ideation, the big part is that you don't worry about the quality of the ideas. You just need to generate. All of this sounds great. The problem is that we're all cognitively lazy, right? We sort of start doing this, and after we make 6 or 7 ideas, it's like, I can't do that, right? And so over the years, designers have come up with a set of tools that allow you to ideate in a way that breaks through that kind of mental laziness and create a larger number of concepts. Sketching is a paramount way how designers do that visually, right? So if you make, and if you sort of see we go back to the title slide for this section, these are all sketches of labs. And this is, I mean, if you look at the actual quality of the drawing, this is not a very skillful artist, right? But what you're able to see is a lot of really different shapes of lens, and even from someone who doesn't have high artistic skills, that he or she is able to actually create a pretty sizable collection of different ways that you could create a lens, right? So this is one way to do that. Brainstorming, which is some of the stuff, an activity I think a number of groups here have done this week, is another way of doing it, where you just do it collectively based on some rules. You can also do mind mapping. You can give yourself a time period in which you try to create as many ideas as possible. You can have ways of sort of giving yourself homework to generate at least 50 ideas, 100 ideas. But the idea is to really at least generate dozens, if not hundreds, of ideas for any given solution that you're trying to create. And that gives you a ton of material. This is your raw material that you can use to synthesize your solution from. Now, of course, the issue is that once you have all of this stuff, you need to choose a method some way, right? And here's just a few examples of how you can do food tracking, right? So you can have sort of database system like MyFitnessPal and most of the current mobile applications use. You can track at various levels of granularity macronutrients. The little picture in the middle is from the application called FewTouch, which was targeting type 2 diabetics, but basically there are 6 icons that just say, did you just have a meal that they had a lot of carbs, or a meal that had few carbs, and so on for snacks and drinks. You can take a picture of a food. You can just use a slider, I ate a lot or ate a little, right? All of these things are variations on the idea of tracking what you eat, right? And if you were doing ideation, you would come up with a whole bunch more, right? So then you need some way of filtering what is worth keeping and refining, and what you discard. And in user-centered design, we call this process design rationale. And it's really the process of articulating and analyzing the trade-offs of and you do this in service of making principled decisions about how to proceed. Right? So the idea is you generate a lot, and then you have a process of saying these options are actually not worth considering any further, and these things are should be more closely analyzed. Right? There are a number of ways of doing that. One framework that I like a lot, and here's the reference where you can find that, is something called questions, options, and criteria, which basically and there's a lot of machinery here that is probably a little bit more heavyweight than most supporting designers actually do. But the basic idea here is that you get things that you can compare that are of the same sort, basically features that are trying to do the same thing. In our case, different ways of logging what you eat, and then being able to formalize the criteria that your solution is trying to achieve, both and making sure that you understand what the priority of those criteria are, and then using those criteria to make selections. So in the case of our food tracking things, we use a criteria might be how much time do you spend tracking food, right? And you want to minimize the amount of time. Or you might want to if your population, if you're dealing with a low numeracy population, you might want to have a system that doesn't require a lot of nutritional knowledge. In which case, something like this is probably not going to work well, because people might not be able to accurately log what exactly they're eating, the level of macronutrients, right? So when you have a list of criteria, that allows you to actually work through which of these things work. You might want to actually be able to graph the data, in which case this is probably not a great option, even though it's really quick, right? On the other hand, you can do all kinds of graphing with just a single slide, right? So based on the criteria that the feature is supposed to accomplish, you can make selections with the understanding that any decision you make in one part of the system can affect a bunch of other stuff. So what you decide to use in terms of tracking food puts constraints on what kind of feedback you're able to provide. Right? If you're asking people to take pictures of the food, it would be very hard to provide detailed feedback about the calories adjusted, or provide graphs of how their nutrition can be. Finally, probably the sort of the piece that I want you to remember the most around user-centered design is that you can do a lot of work in terms of validating your ideas and coming up with something that is going to work well for your population without ever putting a single line of code down, right? And so this notion of prototyping is fundamental to design, which is that you're basically trying to create representations of your system that can be tested really quickly, that can be tested cheaply, that can be discarded, but in forms that provide your users with realistic sense of what using your system would be. And there are various ways of doing this. First of all, why do you want to do it? Well, first of all, you often don't know what you need to build. So you have multiple ideas, and you need some way of figuring out what it is that you need to build. Also, software development is just expensive and it's slow. All right. So by the time you build a system, you've committed a tremendous amount of resources, and there's no going back. Right. So you want to make sure that by the time you start building, you know exactly what you're doing. And also, and I think this is really the key piece, that prototyping allows you to get feedback often and early, so that you can refine your idea many times. There are many ways of doing this. Storyboards are one way of creating prototypes where you really sort of try to work out in visual form how a person would be using a system and what exactly that system would be doing. Wireframes are visual representations of individual screens of the application. This is often probably the single most used form of prototypes. But then you can also have low fidelity interactive prototypes, and I'll come to those in a second, where you actually build, often using just pen and post-it notes and some tape, working representations of your system, and you can test those with users. So wireframes, again, these basically provide you a way of specifying what kind of content would be on the screen, how and what functionality would be represented in different parts of the system, and you can sketch them out by hand. There are different kinds of software tools, both online and on the desktop, that allow you to create these, and you can often crank out a large number of these in a matter of a couple of hours, right? So you can specify the system with very little resources that show you exactly what the system should be doing. Note about these things is that none of these wireframes at this level of fidelity actually tell you anything about what exactly colors will be used, what fonts should be used, or these sort of fine grained details of user design. What they do is they show you the functionality. Again, design is about functionality fundamentally, and what wireframes allow you to do is to actually convey what functionality you're currently considering including in the system. Paper prototypes are probably one of my favorite forms of prototyping, and this is I teach this in every time I teach a class on introduction to interaction design. Students roll their eyes when we ask them when we initially ask them to create paper prototypes. It's like, can we just do this digitally? And pretty much without exception, once they actually go through this exercise, they see just how much they can learn even with something that is as rough as pieces of paper and sort of tape being holding that paper together. And the basic idea here is that you take your wireframes and you add interactive elements to the application. Basically, you can create buttons. You can create different states of the system. So when someone presses a button, you pop that, for example, requires text entry. You put a little piece of paper on the screen that shows the keyboard. They type on the keyboard. You show what happens after that, right? And you can basically create these different interactive elements and then run people through the tasks that your systems are supposed to accomplish. And that gives you both information about are they actually understanding how this thing is supposed to work, as well as they can address a lot of usability issues. Like one of the common things is that happens when you first start designing systems is you go through a path of accomplishing the task, and you finish that, and then there's no way of going back. You can't actually go back to a home screen or correct an error or something like that. A bunch of those kinds of errors can be caught very quickly using low fidelity prototype. Right. So again, both with wireframes and low fidelity prototypes, the issue here, the goal here is to be able to get a lot of feedback very quickly, and you do that by making the process of designing these versions of the system very quickly, and you can make it quick and cheap, so that you can discard the ideas that are not good, and you can very quickly refine the ones that you continue to keep in your system. Does that make sense? I'm going quickly, but there's a lot to cover. So, any questions so far? All right. So, moving on to engagement. All right, and so this is the process. So far, we've been talking about the process. What I want to talk about now for the second part of the talk is some considerations that you should keep in mind when you're developing systems that I think can greatly affect how the system is being experienced and whether an individual is succeeding. And really, at a high conceptual level, I think of engagement as a matter of also the value versus burden ratio, and how that ratio changes over time for the person. So, what's the value that the person is getting from your system, and what is the burden that is being imposed by using the system? And probably the sort of textbook case of this are personal health records. I don't know who of you can work with personal health records, but 10 years ago, we thought this is going to revolutionize medicine and how individuals manage their health in their everyday lives. We had systems like Health Vault and that basically wanted you to put all your health information from all clinical encounters and the drugs you were taking and all this into one database so that next time you get sick, we have all of this information to help you tell the clinician that you see next time with the assumption that you're often changing health systems and insurance and all of that. They would have all the information they need to provide next year. The problem with this is that it's a shitload of work on the patient, right? And it's really only really useful to them when they're really sick, which is also the time when they have the least energy to manage the health record. So you're asking them to put all this information when they're feeling well, when they have no value out of it, and then when its value really comes out when they're sick, when they're unable to manage. And so the value burden ratio is completely out of whack. And basically most of these systems fail. I mean, Health Vault is still it's limping around, but it's not really. Another example of this are, and probably many of you use those, are patient-reported outcome questionnaires, right? Huge things, like big instruments where we're asking patients to put all of this information in. And then it just goes into a black hole. It gets submitted to your health system, and they typically don't get any feedback on these things. And it's great for you as a clinician. You got all this new data, but all the work is on the side of the patient, right? Not sustainable. Another example that's closer to us, and I think this is the one that really helps you wrap your mind around this concept. First of all, value and burden are dynamic constructs, right? And I think this really shows this. So many of you have either used or asked your participants to use time tracking, right? On average, how long do people stay with this stuff? At the release of being able to put that information in at a good level. A couple weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, 3 or 4 days. Yeah, it's really hard to maintain, right? And even if you manage to get them to do it for a while, they usually then after that they quit. And why is this? I mean, some of these systems are actually really well designed, like the one in the job on application is beautiful. Right? In terms of the actual interaction, it's really, really nice. But the problem is that it's still a lot of work to put everything into. Right? If you're eating packaged foods, it's a little bit easier. You can kind of scan it, but if you have homemade foods, or if you go to a restaurant that's not a chain restaurant, it's a huge pain to put information. What happens early on is that you're actually getting a lot of knowledge about your dietary habits initially, right? You're understanding your patterns, you understand both how much you're eating and the kinds of things you're eating. But usually by 2 to 3 weeks, you learn about your patterns, what you're going to learn, right? And now all of a sudden, this value of learning gets dropped, while the burden on trying to continue to do this is there, right? So people stop using it. There's still value in the self-monitoring, right? And we have extensive data that people who monitor their diet end up losing more weight. But the question is this still the right interface past the first couple of weeks, right? If the value that's left is really the value from self-monitoring, with something that is much less granular, like a slider or a single screen with 6 buttons that says I ate a lot, or that it was a big meal and a small meal, or a big snack or a small snack, would that be enough, right? By switching to something like that, you might be able to decrease the burden a fair bit while maintaining the value that is left, which is somewhat. So I think really, when I think about designing for engagement, my mental model of this is that we should be shooting to design systems at any given point in time are providing people more value than they put in product, right? And what that means, how to do that will shift over time. You might need to change what the system is doing. You might need to change the frequency of things. You might even need to change completely the interfaces, like the interface for login. But your goal should be to continue having a system that, and when a person picks it up, they're receiving more value from it. You're asking. Does that make sense? All right. So now a few concrete ways of doing that, both on those of increasing the value side and really things to keep in mind in terms of the burden. So one of the things that you can do is actually you can just make people smile, right? Good design actually matters a lot. And this is my favorite recent example. There are 3 gazillion to-do lists on the App Store, right? But there's a new one that came out called Things that I think is just beautiful. Look at this. So you can actually pop in a new to-do exactly where it needs to go, right? Into the right category. You just have to drag the plus button up. It just, every time I do it, I just get a big grin on my face, right? This is really good design, and often in research projects, you're not going to have just really fantastic interaction designers or resources to do something like this. But you know what? You don't actually have to. Like, so here is a couple of EMA questions from an app that we deployed a few months ago. It's like, yeah, we needed some EMA. Well, it doesn't cost us anything to put some cute icons on it, right? It's still the same damn data, but at least you're giving them something in return for filling out the question, right? So the interaction is something that can actually be where you can have a lot of variation in how you implement it, and trying really taking a user's perspective and trying to make this an enjoyable experience for them. It can go a long way. Another thing that often is really important is to keep in mind is the notion of novelty, right? And Facebook is a prime example of something that people go back to for years, many times a day, just because we are curious creatures. We are wired to crave novelty, and in all of that noise, there's still some interesting stuff that occasionally pops up that keeps you right back, right? So the question is, are there things you can do to make your system not boring? Right? In hard steps, this physical activity intervention we fielded last year, we were giving people suggestions for being active throughout the day that were tied to their context. And we had over 500 suggestions, and even that over a matter of 6 weeks got old to people, right? They just became repetitive. So one of the things that we're looking into is how can we create scalable ways that you can get helpful notification generated either through some combination of crowdsourcing and sort of the researcher editing, or one of the new collaborations we're currently starting is, can you do the whole thing purely in terms of automatic generation, where you can use deep neural nets to actually construct utterances that are appropriate, but you have new utterances that are being generated all the time. So you can actually have a large bank of things that you can use in your interventions. So to increasing the value, and the thing that I didn't really emphasize, but ultimately, probably the biggest thing that you can do for increasing the value of the application is actually addressing a problem that your users care about, right? And I think this is really the main part of formative work, and Vicky emphasized this yesterday as well. There are things we want to solve as health scientists and behavioral scientists that matter in terms of public health, right? But often that's not how your users experience the world. And unless you're actually solving something they care about, you're dead, right? And so the biggest part of the thing that you can do is really try to deeply understand what it is that they care about and actually create systems that are addressing them. Things to keep in mind is that, again, going back to this notion that a lot of things can contribute very quickly to a system being abandoned, integration with daily life is one of them. So how does this system that you're creating fit with the rest of the life that the individual needs, right? When I first started getting into mHealth in mid-2000s, one of the projects we were working on had these activity sensors that were built in-house at Intel Research called the Mobile Sensing Platform that were about the size of a pager, right? But had these bright blue lights on them, right? To indicate that the Bluetooth was working. And we started with something that looked even worse, but it sort of slowly got better over time. We had problem with women wearing it regularly because when they wore dresses, there was nowhere to put the thing, right? But one thing that came out in the interviews is that people stopped wearing these things every time they needed to be somewhere where there was a low level of light. Like if they went to a movie theater or in a restaurant in the evening or they would just take them off because this damn thing was so bright that it would shine through their sweater and the people felt embarrassed, right? So even if when we had somewhere to put it and they could cover it, the light actually made a huge difference in terms of the experience and made it embarrassed, right? If you need women to wear a wrist horn tracker regularly over time, chances are good that the Fitbit will do a lot better than the Garmin, just because the form factor is less. This is not trivial, right? This is actually important. If you need data that is good, we need to be building systems that as much as possible that will integrate with people. And the industrial design ends up being part of that. Another thing that is, I think, really important to note is that a lot of the systems we build end up having some kind of a social component. And we have large literature social matters. The problem is that social is still really hard to get right. And if you screw it up, you can screw things up pretty badly, right? Bonnie had a nice example of that a couple of days ago, right? We've seen some of this even in very early account work. So this is another system that Sunny consolidated around 2005, 2006 called Houston, which was an early mobile health system that was intended to encourage groups of friends to walk together, to support each other in walking. And the idea here was that each one of them was given a pedometer. There was a little mobile phone application, and at the end of each day, they would share it. They would type in the step count from their pedometer into the phone, and that would get shared with the group of friends. So these are friends, right? They all would be get recruited into a study as pods, right? There would 3 or 4 or 5 women would be coming to a study together. Turns out, women are more than happy to share when they're doing well, and they really don't want to share when they have low step count for any reason, right? Whether it's because they got busy at work or they got sick. And if you have only a group of 4 or 5 people, when one person doesn't share, that's really, really visible, right? And then they would get harassed by their friends. Other times, often you would have 1 or 2 people in the group who was really competitive, who was just making everyone else feel miserable, right? And there was one case where a friendship broke over this, right? There were a ton of social frictions that were introduced by this little system that Sunny had absolutely no intention of doing, and basically she couldn't predict, right? So getting social right is, I think, social interactions can be really useful parts of mobile health systems, but it's really, I think this is one of the more sensitive parts of how we do this research, because if we screw it up, the social frictions can be negatively affected. And finally, I'll actually come very well here. Privacy, and this also was brought up a couple of times over the last couple of days, is something that we often don't think carefully enough about. Yes, the societal norms about privacy are changing, but people still care about the privacy of their data. They want to know what is being done with their data. They want to be able to make decisions about what to disclose and to whom. And if the system feels overly intrusive, it can lead to better. The good thing about this, though, is that you can actually do a lot to manage privacy in really good ways. So one of the things that you can often do is not save the raw data. Often, really the only thing that you care about is the label. Right? So even if you're tracking someone's GPS location, what you really care about might be to know when they're at home, to know when they're at work, and when they're in certain kinds of places, right? If they go to a bar, right? And so you might be able to just use the GPS to get the coordinates, translate that coordinates into a label. Is a person at home network. Look it up in the database like Google Places to get the type of the place they're at, and then just discard the raw data. Don't even save it. If doing that will help people feel more comfortable about your system, it's probably worth doing. Unless your research questions are explicitly about location tracking, right? Other things you might be able to do is have, in a similar spirit, one of the things that we found early on, for example, is that people are extremely hesitant about using any kind of system that has a microphone that interrupts computer line, right? They don't want their conversations recorded for a very good reason, and in many contexts, it's illegal, right? If you're a therapist or if you're a lawyer, you just can't do it. However, audio is extremely useful for doing disambiguation of different activities. So you might actually want to have the audio stream to increase your activity recognition accuracy. Well, what you can do is often, if you strip out only the frequencies that correspond to human voice, you still have all kinds of information that is good for activity recognition, but you greatly now reduce the amount of the privacy concerns. And you can manage that. You can we've done studies where we actually play to participants audio of sort of just like raw audio being recorded, and audio of that strips out voice frequencies. And we say, if we keep this, are you okay with that? And we get much higher response rate of people who use the system. That's and also, you can also create functionality in a graded way, where people can opt in for new functionality at the cost of additional privacy concerns. And so you can have a system that at baseline only uses the least intrusive sensing, and then if you need additional features, you can manage that by making sure that people understand what additional types of data will need to get those. So, but doing this in a very explicit way, I think it can go a long way in allaying people's concerns about what's being recorded on that case. All right, so just to summarize, you're trying to design to meet people's real needs as they experience, right? And part of this is negotiation, but really understanding the needs at a very deep level is fundamental part of building systems that are really going to keep people engaged. User-centered design gives you a set of processes that you can use to do that. And there's also a large number of things that you can do to try to manage this value-burden ratio, so that over time that you're always designing a system that provides more value to users than the burden that you impose. Novel interaction design and so on are always. So I'll stop there and take any questions.
So we have time for a few questions. I have a question.
Sure.
So when you built your proposal, what I'm never quite sure when to start. You know what I'm saying? Like, we, in one of my game development grants, article coming out soon in mHealth, we started too early. We didn't have the storyline down, we didn't really. So is there, when you do the ideation and the story, and then at some point, the paper prototyping comes in, but is there a good moment for that? Is that a stupid question?
No, I think that's a really good question. So I think the answer to that is that you can do it at many points.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's cheap means that if you start it early and get good data, means you can actually lose all of that.
We lost time.
You must lose time. You didn't lose a huge amount of time. You didn't lose as much time as you did last time.
That's right.
Right? And so I think the other thing that I didn't mention here is different prototype sensitive. And basically, you would prototype when you have questions that the prototype is able to answer, right? And if an interactive prototype, like a paper prototype, it doesn't correspond to the questions that are still taken. That's probably not the best. So if you still don't have no idea what you should be building, there's no point in paper prototyping. Paper prototyping is done when the functionality of the system, at least initial functionality is set. And you're trying to get the sanity check, does this make sense to users? Is this the right functionality? And then is a whole to the application thing.
Yeah, 'cause I think one of the challenges of all the things that you're learning or that you're coming that you're rubbing up against all at once in this workshop or whatever it's called, this life experience is how to fit the pieces together. You know, which one of Billy's designs comes first? You know, Billy's not necessarily because we often have this argument. So what comes first? Smart, dumb, RCT, not the chicken egg. Louder.
Paper that is on schedule back in 2014 for the show. It kind of helped me organize things around when exactly you need to go in terms of when exactly one type of experimental design fits in the process. You know, this is like I think Ideation has, you know, stage model. They have 5 stages, right? So I think something like that is really almost
Anger, depression. No, that's not Yeah, but you want to send that to me and I will disperse it?
Send that to everybody. I
Yeah.
found it probably an age last week and that's what they talked about the state model.
Send that to me. Very cool, and I'll make sure you guys all get it because I think that's one of our tasks is sort of trying to give you an idea of how all of these pieces fit together when you're trying, you know, in the 24-hour day. Anyway, Kenya, thank you. That was fantastic.
So we have Craig Fox here, who is Harold Williams Chair at the School of Business and Management. Craig is a very interesting person. He's a psychologist by training who has become a thought leader in this field of behavioral economics. And if you wonder, I think for those of us who spend a lot of time coming up with shiny toys to save humanity, and the sad reality is 99.9% of them fail. They don't go beyond the university environment. So what mHTI said, the UX is becoming a very big thing, and the other extension of that is, of course, how do you engage and keep people engaged in those shiny toys and sensors. And so I've asked Craig to come in and share some of the best from the world of business. And I won't give away the plot line except to tell you it is terrific, and the butler did it.
The butler did it. All right, thanks. It's great to be here. Let me see if I can get switched over to my laptop.
Donna knows how this thing works. I think it's back here.
So I did plug in also. Oh, yeah, if you could do that, that'd be great.
Let me see. Donna
And
knows.
I'll go to
Petra, did you guys figure out how this? Or?
I don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
in video 2 maybe or something. What is it?
Just in video 2 and then
Is that it? Was it on video 2? Left screen, center, right screen.
There you go.
Brilliant.
This is right back.
I've got one of my own.
You want to throw your voice? You mean?
I think I can speak loudly. Can you hear me all? Great. Okay, so the title of my talk is a little bit different than advertised. As Vivek said, I'm a behavioral decision theorist is what I am. My training is in economics and psychology, and I've become really interested in recent years in the application of it to influencing behavior in hopefully pro-social ways. And in particular, I've been starting to do a lot of work in the health domain, and I'm very excited about the use of mobile technologies to improve public health. Because I think obviously it's a very powerful tool. I think it's even more powerful if you use these tools with an awareness of behavioral insights from behavioral economics, but also cognitive and social psychology are very powerful. Economists tend to be a little imperialistic. So they take over a lot of psychology, they call it behavioral economics. They take over neuroscience, decision neuroscience, they call it neuroeconomics and so forth. But I want to give you a little bit of background to that and tell you a little bit about some of the work I've been involved in, mostly on the provider side and influencing provider behavior. But I think you'll see lots of applications that might be useful for you in applications using mobile technologies as well. So let me just dive right in and give you a little bit of context. Behavioral decision theory is an outgrowth that comes from neoclassical decision theory, and that's really where it starts in economics. In fact, neoclassical decision theory is really a foundation of a lot of social sciences and public policy as well, or health policy, as the case may be. And it's founded on heroic assumptions about what a representative actor looks like. A representative actor is a member of this rarefied species that we sometimes refer to as Homo economicus, right? Economic man. That if you can make heroic assumptions about how people behave, they behave in ways to maximize their self-interest. They're kind of selfish, self-interested, and super smart, right? That they can sort of scan the domain to choose the options that maximize their self-interest. It's obviously a simplifying assumption, but a very powerful one that allows us to build models and predictions about how people will behave in various kinds of settings, including complicated strategic interactions, markets, and so forth. And if you subscribe to this point of view that people, at least as a first approximation, act to maximize their self-interest, then you have basically three tools as a policymaker to influence behavior. Those three primary tools are information and education, first of all. Tell people what's in their best interests, what constitutes healthy behavior, for instance, what the government thinks is in your best interest, what have you. And theoretically, people will see that it's in their best interest and follow, and it doesn't really matter how you present the information as long as the information is available to them. Secondly, monetary incentives, right? When you think of economists, you think of incentives. Let's align the incentives of workers to the needs of the firm, for instance, or pay doctors for performance if you want doctors to behave in a particular way, and so forth. And the third thing is regulation. Tell people what they can and cannot do. And the economist would say that only works, of course, if you back it up with a disincentive, like a penalty, right? Or some sort of other inducement. Decades of research beginning in psychology and now growing into what we now call behavioral economics has recognized that actually people fall short of this Olympian standard of rationality, that we actually are quite limited in our ability to process information and attend to things in our environment. We're actually not purely self-interested. We care about how we perform relative to other people, for instance. We care about the acceptance of our social groups. And we rely on mental shortcuts sometimes to simplify just complex decisions, which can lead us to systematically biased behaviors. A representative individual looks more like, well, here's an MRI of it, something like that. A member of a species we might refer to as Homo economicus. But the good news is, if you have an awareness of those sort of what you might call behavioral shortcomings, it opens up a new set of tools that you can use to influence behavior. So not only information, but how you frame the information, how you format it, how you present it, what kind of feedback you provide, what frequency you present the feedback in, maybe through the use of mobile technology, matters quite a lot. Not just monetary incentives, but there are behavioral incentives where you can get more bang for your buck by recognizing, for instance, that people overweight low probabilities, and so lottery incentives are actually more cost effective, let's say. As we'll see, and I'll give more examples of that. And also social incentives. Sometimes people, including doctors, for instance, are more motivated by the approbation of their peers than they are by a little extra money in their paycheck. And then finally, you don't have to rely on hard regulation, but you can use soft touch interventions that nudge people to behave in the way that you'd like them to by making the desirable behavior easier or more fun, or the less desirable behavior a little bit harder to do, but preserve people's freedom to choose. So I'm going to talk about today behavioral information, behavioral incentives, and behavioral regulation, which I hope will inspire you to think of some applications in an mHealth world. So let me start with information. Rational agents, as I say, have unbiased expectations. They process information thoroughly and consistently, and are sensitive to content rather than format with which the information is presented to them. Behavioral agents, that is to say real people, have biased expectations, limited memory and information processing capacity, and are sensitive to the format and timing and all kinds of other aspects of the information. And so that leaves us some interesting information tools. The first thing I'll talk about is active decision support. Right? Decision analysts come up with tools that help us guide us towards making more rational decisions, but also passive decision support that just makes it really easy to make the right decision by presenting the right kind of information in the right format at the right time in front of us, with the hope that we'll be more likely to act on it if it's presented in the right way. And then monitoring and feedback, of course. So let's start with active decision support. And I don't have too much to say about this, other than the fact that software obviously can overcome a lot of biases in complex diagnostic decision making. So for instance, we know that people are not very good at thinking in a Bayesian manner, right? They don't know how to compute Bayes' theorem. We tend to underweight, for instance, prior probabilities. Well, we can just present people with technology that helps doctors or diagnosticians, that helps compute what the posterior odds are of a particular disease, let's say, as a function of a particular test result. That's all well and good. What I would like to emphasize is that it may not be enough, and sometimes there are behavioral issues that remain. How do people use that output? For instance, computer-assisted diagnosis sounds great, but there are studies recently that show that it can inflate the rate of false negatives. If the computer tells me there's no tumor there, then I'm a little bit less critical, and I kind of shut off that faculty, some of those critical faculties. Or, as I'll show you in a moment, the way in which information is framed can influence decisions. Are you presenting survival rates for different treatments, or mortality rates, actually, and systematically bias the decision maker? Presentation effects matter. Do you present probabilities in terms of numbers, as pie charts, bar charts? In a more frequentistic manner, it turns out it can make a big difference in how people use that information. And if I had more time, I'd go into more details on that. I just want to draw your attention to it because it's something that's important to be sensitive to. Passive decision support is important because we have limited memory, we're forgetful, we can be easily distracted. So reminders of patient history, medications, treatment options, and so forth can be obviously a useful tool for helping guide healthcare providers to make better decisions. A tool Gawande has written recently about checklists and how important checklists are in a variety of domains, but in particular in health domains. For instance, the surgical safety checklists that are often monitored by nurses in operating rooms have reduced the rate of complications in a number of hospitals nationwide. Providing information in a timely manner or reminders in a timely manner is super important, and also hopefully in the right format. There's a tendency for the engineers to want to present information in a way that has all the nuance and all the detail and tends to be overcomplicated. And that can be a problem. Take the well-meaning old USDA health pyramid, and I recognize it's a little hard to read here, but you get the gist of it, that there's, grains and vegetables and all this, but what does the width mean exactly? And lots of categories and pictures, and what do the stairs mean? I have no idea. It's a little bit hard for ordinary consumers to act on that, recognizing limitations in people's information processing capacity in more recent years. They've simplified that. So now here's the advice you get. Much easier to act on if you know, okay, I need to load up my plate with half fruits and vegetables, right? So simplification. What kind of metric do we communicate to people if we want to give them feedback? Let me just give you a little quiz here. Let's suppose you have in your garage your Lamborghini, your pride and joy, and you're thinking, well, it's not exactly very environmentally conscious to drive something that gets only 14 miles per gallon. I could trade it in for, a Ferrari that gets 16 miles per gallon. Or, my spouse drives a Ford Focus and is thinking of getting a Honda Civic Hybrid that gets 45 miles per gallon. And let's suppose that you and your spouse drive these automobiles about the same number of miles per year. And you're committed to trading in one of these. Which one should you trade in if you care about the environment or how much you spend on gas? It seems obvious to most people that the answer is, of course, this one. And you would be wrong. And the reason you'd be wrong is miles per gallon is an efficiency metric. But what we really care about is a consumption metric, which is the reciprocal of that. If you do the calculation, supposing you go 10,000 miles this year, you would save 89 gallons if you traded in the Lamborghini for the Ferrari, whereas if you trade in the Ford for the Honda, you'd save only 63 gallons. So we're giving people the wrong information. Metrics matter. Okay, I talked about this, but let me just sort of bring it home for you. The y equals 1 over x function, right? Transforming an efficiency metric into a consumption metric. You remember, well, it looks like this. It's steepest at the low end. So you get the most bang for the buck at the low end of mileage in terms of how much gas you save, right? Which is why Obama's Cash for Clunkers program was actually a pretty smart one. For instance, suppose that you're driving 100 miles and you trade in a car that gets 10 miles per gallon for one that gets 20 miles per gallon. As you can see, you save 5 gallons, right? But if you trade in one that gets 20 miles per gallon for one that gets 50 miles per gallon, right? You go from consuming 5 gallons to go 100 miles to 2 gallons, you only save 3. Do you see? What we should be doing is giving people different information, which is how many gallons you can consume for a fixed number of miles. The researchers who noticed this problem and noticed and documented the psychological bias people have to make bad decisions on the basis of it, in 2008 influenced the EPA, and the EPA went from their old window stickers here that you can see that were miles per gallon to this one beginning in 2013. I'll say it's not great because there's too much information there, right? I said simplify a moment ago, but at least the familiar miles per gallon metric is supplemented with information on how much it would cost you over a certain number of years, annual fuel costs, gallons per 100 miles. So it's a step in the right direction. What kind of metric matters when approaching people who are making daily public health decisions, like, for instance, how much I should eat? You know, a lot of engineers or economists might say, just post the calorie information, right? People make good decisions. But there again, we have a choice. How exactly do we want to post that calorie information? Do people really know how to use calorie information? Do they really understand the metric? I mean, more is worse, I guess, if I'm trying to lose weight, but there are lots of ways that you could present it. Some researchers at Carnegie Mellon recently did a study where they drove out their research van in Pittsburgh, and they offered participants a choice of snack. And they presented calorie information in one of several different ways to see what would influence them to eat less, eat a more healthier snack. So here are the different kinds of ways they did it. One is a control where there's just no information, just choose what you want. Here's the standard calorie information. Now here's a little bit more information where they were given some daily intake as a reference. So nutrition experts recommend that men should eat about 2,400 calories per day, and women should eat about 2,000 calories per day, right? Does that help? Does that make me less likely to spend a quarter of my calories on the Hostess apple pie? How about this? Daily calorie information and daily snack intake reference. Nutrition experts recommend 200 calories per day for snacks or desserts. Wow, the apple pie is now 2.5 days worth of consumption, right? Or percentage of daily calories, or percentage of daily snack calories. That really brings it home, doesn't it? But it's still a little bit complicated. What if you did something else that really brings it home? Minutes on a treadmill. Do you really want to spend 47 minutes on a treadmill to have that apple pie, or 4 minutes for the apple crisps? Or nutritional grade, which throws out information, but it makes it kind of simpler. I know what an A is, and I know what an F is, and I know I want to avoid the F and pursue the A's, or at least the B. How about this one? If you keep on eating like this till the end of the year, this is what your body's going to look like. So these are what we call heuristic cues, right? Simplifying kind of shortcuts. Or the traffic light rating, which is even simpler than the grade rating, right? Green means go, yellow proceed with caution, and red, no, stop. Here's the results. And what to take away from this is it does make actually a substantial difference in how much people consume. Obviously, the control is the worst, but giving people calorie information just isn't enough. And generally speaking, the best numerical formats were the more heuristic cues. At least of the numericals, the percentage of daily snack calories did about as well. But other than that, they didn't do quite as well. It matters what kind of metric you use, and the traffic lights are a good one, or the expected body size seemed to work in this particular study. Thinking about what metrics speak to people is important. Framing, as I mentioned, really is important. And in fact, one of the key insights from behavioral economics is that people treat losses differently than gains, and that framing matters. And in particular, people, for instance, tend to be risk averse when they're thinking about gains, and risk seeking when they're thinking about losses. An old study that was done by my late mentor and some of his colleagues who were physicians looked at the decisions by healthcare providers. In particular, you describe an option for an operation in terms of the probability of dying, and in this case, 50% preferred radiation to surgery. If you describe it in terms of probability of living, only 18% preferred radiation to surgery. It was all the same statistics. It was just a reframing. Probability of living, probability of dying are complements of each other. It makes a difference. Monitoring and feedback can be useful information tools. Obviously, directly monitoring provider behavior, it's a lot easier to do it these days, both with mobile technologies, electronic health record systems. And feedback can provide incentives and opportunities for people to change their habits. Obviously, a lot of surgeons, for instance, don't get a lot of feedback on readmission rates as a function of what their regimen is when they release. And the more feedback they get, the better position they'll be in to learn and make better decisions. Hand washing is another one that I think is really important because, as you know, hospital-borne infections are quite common and can lead, some estimate, to tens of thousands of deaths per year. Here's one study that was done, and this is a low-tech version. I have ideas about a higher-tech version, so if anybody wants to talk to me about this, I'd love to. But here's a low-tech version that was done now half a dozen years ago, where this is just a map of a clinic where there were different cameras that monitored whether or not healthcare providers wash their hands entering and exiting patient encounters. They all know they should do. And there was an information display board where they were given feedback on that. Target rate of 95%. They look at the aggregate and they present it to people. And this is the effect it had. And you don't have to have binoculars from the back row to tell there's a huge and almost instantaneous effect. Hand hygiene compliance in this test clinic went from 10% to 90% almost overnight. This, I think, there are great opportunities to do this electronically. And again, I'm happy to talk to somebody offline about ideas, specific ideas I have about that. Feedback protocols matter a lot. This is something that was driven home to me fairly recently. There are a lot of near misses that happen, a lot of events in health context that are near misses, and we like to kind of not encode those as events. Those are non-events. For instance, anybody remember when this plane had a double bird strike from LaGuardia Airport and Captain Sully heroically landed on the Hudson River? What's interesting about this incident is the FAA had voluntary means for pilots to report bird strikes, which are not totally uncommon. What's uncommon is the double bird strike where you lose all power. But it seems a pity that it was not mandatory because a lot of people just don't want to report it. If you can walk away from the landing, right, then it's a fine landing. And so we missed decades of opportunity to collect data, what weather conditions, what airports, which runways, which directions, what time of year, and so forth might be the most dangerous. By that same token, I was speaking with an anesthesiologist at UCLA a few years back, and she says that in the training, you know, one common mistake the trainees make is they try to extubate prematurely. And what happens, usually the patient starts to gag for breath, and usually you can reintubate. Once in a while, you can't, and you have to do an emergency tracheotomy. It's a horrible thing, obviously. But there are no protocols for reporting that, to learn from that. It's a near miss. So thinking about what are we giving feedback on, I think is really super important. And when you think about it in a mobile health technology context, I think there are lots of perhaps opportunities to think about what's the cutoff for reporting something and giving feedback. Feedback timing matters also. It's not just providing information, but providing it at a moment when somebody can use it and remember it and implement it. I'll give you an analogy from a study that was done at a hotel where valets reminded drivers to wear their seatbelts. In the control condition, there was no reminder. In the delayed reminder condition, when they turned in their ticket and they paid for it at the counter, they were told, you know, oh, remember to buckle up. And then about 5.5 minutes later, they get their car, they get it. The last condition was an immediate reminder where the valet, as they're entering the car, says, remember to buckle up, and then goes. It's not like they're hovering over the person to see if they do it, right? But the timing, it turns out in the study, makes a big difference. The control condition, a little more than half the people buckle up. In the delayed reminder condition, there's almost no effect. In the immediate reminder condition, though, big effect. So it's not just the information, it's the timing of the information. Okay, those are a few things to think about in terms of behavioral information. How about incentives? So rational agents act to maximize their own self-interest. Self-interest is defined as expected utility of benefits minus costs of act. Behavioral agents, on the other hand, are overly sensitive to losses relative to gains and to low probability events, as I mentioned earlier. They also seek belonging and approval from relevant social groups. We care how we compare to our peers and what our peers think of us, and are we adhering to norms and so forth. So I'll look at a few of these kinds of incentives: probabilistic incentives, loss incentives, pre-commitments, which are interesting in self-control situations, and social incentives. Prospect theory is the maybe most important article that laid the foundation for behavioral economics by these two Israeli psychologists who I had the good fortune of working with, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. And it replaces the neoclassical economic model of decision under risk, expected utility theory, with a more psychologically valid one. And two of the aspects of prospect theory that I'll highlight are, one, that we tend to overweight low probability events. This is why insurance and gambling are two of the most profitable industries out there, right? People overweight the possibility of their house burning down, so they pay a premium for half home insurance, or even a lot of people rental car insurance. And overweighting of low probability gains means that that small possibility of becoming a millionaire is very attractive to a lot of people, so they buy lottery tickets. They like those long shots. Well, you can use that to influence people's behavior. There's some nice studies that Kevin Volpe at Penn, along with George Lowenstein at Carnegie Mellon and some others did, where they tried to get patients to take their medication. In this case, it was warfarin, an anticoagulant. They presented patients in the study with a pillbox, and the pillbox had different compartments for different days of the week, and it was hooked up to the internet. So the physicians knew when a patient was opening up a particular compartment, and they assumed that if a patient opened up that compartment on that day, they took their medication. So how do you incentivize actually following through on it when you're monitoring it? What they did was they assigned each patient a 2-digit number. And they said, okay, we're going to draw a 2-digit number ourselves each day, and if you took your medication on that day and you matched both digits, you get $100. And if you match only one of the 2 digits, then you get $10. So there are really two different versions of that. One is where the order of the digits matters, in which case the expected value is $3 per day. Another where it doesn't matter which order the digits are if you match. Costs the experimenters $5 a day, but it's basically the same approach. So what we're leveraging is a couple of things. One, the tendency to overweight low probabilities. The other thing that's nice about it is it's kind of leveraging this loss sensitivity, because you're thinking to yourself, if I don't take my medication this day and then I find out I would have won $100, that's really bad, right? So it's kind of devious because you get feedback on whether or not you would have won. The other thing that's nice about this protocol is you don't just have this low probability event that people tend to overweight, but you also have intermittent reinforcement, right? Once every 10 days or so in the $3 protocol, you're getting something for it. So you don't learn to get discouraged, let's say, when you don't win the big prize. So it's a really nice protocol, and this is the effect that it had on blood levels, not just behavior, but actual health results. Before the lottery, during the lottery, and alas, after the lottery is discontinued, it goes back. But I'm told that actually spending $3 or $5 a day on these patients is cost effective in terms of the negative health effects that it prevents. So that's one way of thinking about how we can get more bang for our buck with financial incentives. Here's another one in a different context with respect to loss aversion. A really fun study where fun from the standpoint of a researcher like me, maybe not the participants. They tried to get math teachers to improve their students' scores. And they did it one of two ways. Either they told the teachers, if you bring up your students' scores a certain amount, we're going to pay you a bonus. Or they said, we're going to give you the bonus in advance and take it away if your students' scores don't go up. Whatever, right? So there it is. It's a gain frame versus a loss frame. And the gain frame improved scores only 1.3%, but the loss frame had a huge effect on the standard deviation in terms of distribution of score. I don't know what the teachers union thinks about that, but it was effective. Well, another bias that people have in their behavior has to do with intertemporal choice over time. And this is a problem for a lot of health outcomes. When I present my MBA students with a choice between $50 and 52 weeks from today, or $55, 53 weeks from today, what do you think they say? Most of them take 55 and 53 weeks, right? Because you're getting a 10% return in 1 week. Of course you would. That's huge. The interesting thing is what happens when you say choose between $50 right now or $55 1 week from today. Now things switch. And people say, I'd rather have 55 today. We're present biased psychologically. And that's a problem because it leads to dynamic inconsistencies. So imagine somebody says, I want $55 in 53 weeks, and then 52 weeks from then, I say, I know you said you wanted 55 53 weeks, but now that's only a week from now. What would you rather have, $50 right now and $55 1 week from today? Now they switch and they say, oh, just give me the money now. That's a problem. Like when you say, okay, I'm going to start that diet right away, and then, you get to the dessert bar and you say no, or I want to get up early in the morning, then the alarm goes off, right? Well, what do you do about that kind of behavior? One clever solution was devised by a behavioral economist at Yale named Dean Carlin. He launched a company and website called stickwith2ks.com. This is an opportunity for you to put out a contract on yourself. From an economic standpoint, it's nonsense. Why would you limit your options? But from a behavioral standpoint, it makes sense. I would pre-commit when I'm in a cold state, so I don't infringe on the kind of, commit the bad behaviors when I'm in the hot emotional state, right? So you want to stop smoking? Give us the credit card number. And, let us charge $1,000 and give it to charity if you don't quit smoking, or if you don't lose 20 pounds in a month or whatever. You nominate a referee, some friend who's going to verify whether or not you comply. They have an even more devious version of it, which is instead of a charity, you nominate an anti-charity, right? So if I don't lose those 20 pounds in the next 2 months, $1,000 goes to the American Nazi Party, or something like that. It's been fairly successful at getting people to meet some health goals and other goals. Or here's a nice little cute device, Clocky, the patented alarm clock that runs away and hides to get you out of bed. It gives you one chance to get up, but if you snooze, Clocky will jump off your nightstand and wheel around your room looking for a place to hide, beeping all the while to get out of bed to silence it. Devious. So that's a pre-commitment incentive. The final category of incentives is social incentives. It's recognizing that we're strongly motivated by social concerns. We want to belong to a group and follow its norms. We want to secure approval of others. We want to maintain a good pro-social identity. And in my experience, these kinds of incentives can be more powerful at influencing behavior even than financial incentives, at least than modest financial incentives. I'll highlight two social norms that are pervasive. One is descriptive social norms. These are norms about how group members actually behave. And another is injunctive social norms, how group members should behave. There was a very highly cited and interesting study that was run by my colleague, Noah Goldstein, and some of his colleagues. His mentor was a guy named Bob Cialdini, if you know that name. He's a leader in the research in social influence. He was also the senior author on the paper. Anyway, they were interested in how do we reduce energy consumption. So they went in this experiment to a neighborhood, San Marcos, I think it is, California, and they observed how much energy homes were consuming. And half of them were green homes that were consuming less than the median, and half of them were energy hogs, right, consuming more than the median. These homes were randomly assigned to receive different door hangers. And the difference in the door hangers was both of them had a descriptive social norm, like the energy hogs got the message, your neighbors use less energy than you do. You use a lot. That's the descriptive social norm. The injunctive social norm just gives it an added kick. That's a bad thing, right? You get the frowny face. And the same thing for the energy misers. They were told your neighbors use more energy than you do, you use less. And if they got the injunctive norm also, they got the smiley face. So what effect does that have when you go back a month at the end of the month and you look at how much energy was consumed? Here's the effect it has. First of all, when you get the descriptive norm only, the energy hogs who are told their neighbors use less actually consume substantially less energy that month. That's the good news. The bad news is the energy misers kind of backslid, and they thought, oh well, you know, I may as well leave the air conditioning on a little bit more and the lights. We're going too far in conserving energy. What happens when you supplement the descriptive norm with the injunctive norm? Well, now you get a bigger effect on the energy hogs, and you sort of blunt the backsliding on the misers. This technique actually took the notice of a couple of young enterprising entrepreneurs who started a company around this idea. And basically, this is a centerpiece to a business that provides feedback to customers of energy companies and members of firms who want to reduce their energy consumption. They're very successful. They went public. This study, by the way, only appeared in, I think, 2007. And this company is worth something like $500 million already. But sometimes you can do well by doing good, right? So how about applying this to a public health problem? I'll tell you a little bit about work that we've done. I'm interested, one public health problem that we've been interested in is the problem of superbugs. Of course, you're all familiar with superbugs, antibiotic-resistant bacteria. One recent estimate from a British study is that they kill 50,000 people per year in the US and Europe. And if aggressive means aren't taken to address the issue by creating new antibiotics and also reducing the profligate use of antibiotics where they're not called for, it could kill as many as 10 million people per year worldwide by 2050. That's one person every 3 seconds, I think. This, as I said, a major cause of antibiotic resistance. Well, about half of it is the use of it in animal feed where it isn't needed. But half of it is overprescription by healthcare providers. According to the Centers for Disease Control, about half the time when you get antibiotics prescribed to you in an outpatient setting, you don't need them. Doctors, I think, feel like they want to satisfy their patients who oftentimes ask for antibiotics or don't want to be told to go home and take cough drops after they've gone to the expense and trouble of going to the physician for an upper respiratory infection. The White House in 2015 actually had a national action plan for combating antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The first thing that they had on their list was what we need to do is reduce inappropriate antibiotic use by 50% by 2020. I'm not so sure it's a priority of the Trump administration, but there it is. So I was involved in a study that we published last year in JAMA, and I'll tell you about a couple of the conditions and what we did in these practices that were in Boston associated with Harvard, Northwestern, in Chicago, and also in Los Angeles. We had some of my colleagues were from RAND and USC, and also here. Anyway, one of the interventions was just to provide peer comparison information. So what we did was we sent a monthly email feedback. These were, what we looked at was antibiotic prescriptions for acute respiratory infections. And we provided them feedback once per month with an email on what percentage of the time did you comply with the norm and not prescribe antibiotics for a non-bacterial infection. We also gave them feedback on the top decile in their region, the top performers, and whether or not they were a top performer. So that's one intervention. Another intervention we had was what we call the accountable justification condition. If a physician tried to prescribe antibiotics for a non-bacterial diagnosis, that triggered in the electronic health record system a pop-up, and they had to justify it, and that justification was added to the chart. A little speed bump in the workflow, to which we thought they might be myopically sensitive, but also sensitive to the fact that it's holding a mirror up to them and their peers are reading this. So if you put in some cockamamie answer to the question, maybe you think twice before you actually follow through with it. So peer comparison. This is the email once a month. This is your rate, this is the top rate, you are or not a top performer. In the control condition, first of all, I will say that nationally, about half the time, right, about half the time when you don't need them, you get inappropriate antibiotics. In our sample, we had some elite sample, I guess, where we started at 25%. And here's the interesting part that I have to fess up. Even in the control condition, just telling people you've been enrolled in a study, and we're monitoring your antibiotic prescriptions, brought it down by about a half, which a lot of people would take as an embarrassment. This is a Hawthorne effect, right? This makes it hard for us to figure out the impact of our intervention. I take it as actually kind of good news. What it says is, What more cost-effective intervention than say, hey, you're in a study, we're measuring. That's all you have to do, and you have a big effect. It also speaks to the power of social incentives. They care about these researchers from these elite universities and what they think, I suppose. It makes them more conscious about what they're doing. But more to the point, the peer comparison intervention took it down to less than 5% native, which is 1 email a month. Big, big effect. What about the accountable justification note? So here's the EHR, one of the systems anyway. So, you've prescribed antibiotics for likely viral diagnosis, enter in your explanation. My patient demanded it. Well, that would be a bad one. Most of the ones that stuck were decent. They weren't quite that vacuous. Anyway, what happened? Between baseline and the intervention actually was almost as effective as the one I just showed you. Really effective, really easy. You're just about to submit a grant proposal to do something similar with opioid prescription for post-surgical treatment. Okay, what about social accountability? Well, it can be used in a lot of domains. You health people will probably recognize some of them, right? We have the Wi-Fi body scale that can, send text messages to people or messages on Facebook or whatever. Blood pressure monitors do it now, exercising. There are lots and lots of opportunities with mobile technologies to use social accountability to hold the mirror up or broadcast people's behavior, which can be a powerful mechanism for influence. Yeah. Well, there was another one in here. I thought I had a slide in here, but I must have erased it. Just to give you one other example of something we did that speaks to accountability is the power of making public commitments. We went into some health clinics where we put up a poster that was in English and Spanish saying basically that the healthcare provider was committed to responsible use of antibiotics and sort of explained it a bit. And there's a signature from the healthcare provider and a photograph. And we put those in the waiting rooms. That had a big effect on reducing inappropriate prescriptions as well. So again, another kind of social intervention. Let me go to the last category, which is regulation, which is one of the more exciting ones, I think. Rational agents are responsive only to information, financial incentives, and regulation that has positive or negative incentives attached to it. Behavioral agents are responsive to little nudges that facilitate desired behavior without prohibiting other options or significantly altering information or incentives. We oftentimes kind of take the path of least resistance, right? We oftentimes pursue options that are fun or avoid options that are a little harder. I mean, take this picture here, right? We're going to the gym, right? And everybody wants to take the escalator because it's there and it's easy. And part of what this operates on is the sense that, we all make lots of choices during the day and we get tired. It's effortful to make choices and to take action. And as we go through our days, we get more and more tired and we're more likely to take the path of least resistance. Here's a chilling graph from a study that was done by a former student of mine who's now at Stanford and some of his Israeli colleagues, where they went to Israeli judges. And the Israeli judges were making decisions about whether or not to grant parole to prisoners that were brought in front of them. What's the path of least resistance if you're making a parole decision? If you can't concentrate, focus, really justify what you do, you don't give parole, right? Because you don't want the prisoner to commit a crime while they're out. Now that's on my head, right? Well, the prisoners come in a pretty arbitrary random order. So it's not like there's, you get the really tough cases first or last or whatever. But time of day makes a huge difference on whether or not they're granted parole. If it's the first prisoner to come in, first thing in the morning, you have about a 2/3 chance of getting parole. And then as you get more and more kind of fatigued, it crashes to almost zero. And then there's the morning break where you have some juice and a muffin or Danish, whatever. You get a little glucose in the system and boom, it pops back up to almost 2/3 again. And then it crashes right before lunch and then it goes up and then it crashes. That's chilling. Here's from a paper I was involved in with antibiotic prescription, not as dramatic, but the same kind of effect, where the path of least resistance is the opposite. Give the patient what they want, right? And you look at the hours in shift, and over the course of the shift, antibiotic prescriptions go up. And then there's a lunch break, it goes down, it goes back up.
Has anybody ever actually level?
There's been some work on glucose. Well, there's a famous study that Roy Baumeister did where they depleted people by having to do some taxing task, and then they looked at their ability to self-regulate. And then in some cases, they gave them lemonade with an artificial sweetener versus a real sweetener, and the real sweetener actually led to more restoration of their ability to self-regulate. The only reason I present that tentatively is some have argued that that's not replicable. As you may have heard, there's a replicability crisis in a lot of social psychology. So I won't endorse that, but I'll just report that that finding. I think more needs to be done to connect it to physiological response. But obviously, it speaks to things like modifying scheduling and breaks and reducing decision fatigue, and minimizing throughout the day how much somebody who's trying to regulate their own behavior, for instance, in the service of their health, has to feel put out by holding themselves back, for instance, from doing something like eating cookies. I'm going to speak to that in a minute a little bit more. So instead of regulation, behavioral version is a softer one that we call nudging now, in honor of the book that coined the term nudge by behavioral economist Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, who's actually a constitutional law scholar, but a polymath who's really interested in behavioral interventions. He's the former administrator of the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs under Obama. And so he applied a lot of this in a behavioral policy context. In any case, I'll talk about a few different kinds of ways of nudging. I'll talk first about channel factors, which are just, it's a term from social psychology. Opening up the channel to make behavior easier facilitates the behavior you want, like giving somebody a self-addressed stamped envelope in the old analog days if you want them to buy a magazine or something. Selective exposure. We'll talk about smart defaults, ordering and partitioning, and then commitments and plans a little bit more. Am I running over? Am I in bonus time? A couple more minutes? Are you going to bring out the shepherd's crook if I go 5 minutes extra?
They're going to get
Oh, they need to get glucose? Okay. Well, sorry, I've been going at a lazy pace today. There's a study where they tried to make something, by making behavior easier, they facilitate the desired behavior. In this case, it was families who are eligible for government assistance for education. And they approached some low-income families who had somebody who was eligible, who didn't have a bachelor's degree, was the right age. When they were helping these families fill out their tax forms, now they had all the information they needed to fill out the FAFSA form, which is a kind of complicated 10-page government form, right? They made it really easy by filling it out. So there's a control condition, one where they gave them information, they automatically filled the form out. And what happened is when they automatically filled out the form for them, they were much more likely to submit the form, much more likely to have somebody matriculate, much more likely to have somebody complete a couple of years. Just make it easy and people will do it. You think, well, how much can it make a difference if it's a small transaction cost? It actually makes a bigger difference than you think. Selective exposure, again, in the eating context, this is important. There's a great book by Brian Wansink of Cornell, where he talks about a lot of studies he did, including one that won him the Ig Nobel Prize, the self-refilling soup bowl study. But one of his classic studies, what he did was he would put a candy dish on a secretary's desk and refill it when it needed to be refilled, and measure how much candy they eat. You put it on their desk, they eat a lot more than if you put it on the filing cabinet across the office, right? So it doesn't take much effort to get up and grab one, but psychologically it's actually very important. Or you present a transparent dish versus an opaque dish. If you don't have to look at it, right, and feel put out at every moment, resist it, you're actually more likely to resist it. Out of sight, out of mind. Well, there are lots of opportunities to modify clinical environments also to make sure that you facilitate the right kind of behavior. You want somebody to wash hands. Don't put the sink way in the back of the room. Don't make it confusing. Now, which one's the soap and which one's the dispenser? You want people to refill the empty dispensers, have a flag pop up. That can help. Having a mirror in there, it seems, may actually improve the chances that they wash their hands. Yeah. So there are lots of opportunities to think about that. Defaults. Defaults are the poster boy of behavioral economics. This is like one of the most important ways that we can nudge people's behavior. This here is a picture of organ donation rates in European countries. Some of them have opt-in policies, like in California, you have to put the donor dot on your driver's license to say I'm consenting to be an organ donor. Other countries have presumed consent unless you opt out. probably tell which are which, right? Your grandmother would have told you that it makes a difference, but she wouldn't have guessed it would make this much difference. I mean, take demographically similar Germany and Austria. Germany's opt-in and has only a 12% donation rate. Austria's opt-out, and it's almost universal. We applied in a lot of domains. One of my favorite studies applying this to the health domain came out last year. Malhotra and colleagues changed the EHR system. When a physician orders a branded drug, it would automatically, by default, replace it with a generic equivalent. Presumably saves the patient and the insurance company a lot of money. But you can opt out by clicking the dispense as written box. What effect did this have? In the course of a single month, the rate of use of generics went from 40% to 96%. Huge, huge effect. Small change in the architecture of the EHR. So there are lots of other examples of defaults, but the shepherd's crook is coming, so let me move on. Ordering makes a difference. What order you present options to people, for instance, in the EHR. On ballots, it turns out, it can make a difference of 1 to 3 percentage points going first, that primacy effect. By the way, George W. Bush was top of the ballot in Florida in 2000 and won by less than this margin. Just the fact that he was on top made a difference in that election. On menus, that happens too. Grouping effects is something that we've been interested in. We presented vignettes to doctors. They involved upper respiratory infections. And we provided an order list in which we either listed the less aggressive treatment, or the more, this is the less aggressive, actually, I should say less aggressive treatment is listed individually, right, as cough lozenge, cough split, and the more aggressive was listed, as grouped way here. Or we did it the other way around. The more aggressive were listed individually, and the less aggressive were grouped, and we counterbalanced the order. And what we found is that makes a big difference. You see something listed by itself, and now it seems like a more appropriate or more popular choice. You see it grouped, it seems like that's the throwaway stuff. And you'd think that healthcare providers wouldn't be influenced. They're influenced. When you group the aggressive treatments, there's a 27% decrease in the use of those aggressive treatments. So if you think that they're inappropriate, that's one way to discourage their use without limiting autonomy of the physicians. Okay. Commitments and plans. It turns out there's been a lot of work, for instance, in the voting domain. You remind people to vote doesn't really have much effect. You ask somebody, do you intend to vote? If they make a public commitment to voting, it actually increases. 2% may seem like not a lot, but it is a lot. If it's a cheap intervention like a mailer or a quick phone call from a phone bank. You can improve it even further if you get people to make plans, articulate their plan. You say, okay, so you say you're going to vote, great. Do you know where your voting precinct is? What time of day do you plan to go? When people form concrete action plans, they're more likely to follow through. So these kinds of things have been in a health domain. Here's where I had my public commitment poster. I talked about this before, and here's the result that I mentioned to you earlier. I just had it in a different part of my presentation than I remember. But here's a case of a planning prompt. This is a flu vaccination, and an insurance company. It's a study that appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences about half a dozen years ago. If you present people information on the flu clinic versus, that's a control condition, versus same thing, just have them write down when they plan to go, just prompt them to plan how they're going to do it, that makes a pretty big difference. 12% increase in the likelihood of getting this. So I'm at the end of my presentation. I hope that I persuaded you of the importance of taking not only a neoclassical perspective, if you want to influence public health, perhaps through the use of mobile technologies, but also think about behavior and behavioral failings and shortcomings and so forth. These behavioral insights can be a very powerful supplement in influencing public health for the better. And the final thing I'll say is, if you're interested in learning more about behavioral interventions in a policy context, we have an association that involves a lot of people in the health domain too. We have a journal called Behavioral Science and Policy. If you want to check it out online, go to behavioralpolicy.org. Love to get submissions from people doing these kinds of interventions. And that's it. Thank you for your attention.